Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is Julia Brock. Julia is an associate professor of history at the University of Alabama and the author of a new book, Closed Seasons: The Transformation of Hunting in the Modern South. That was just published by the University of North Carolina Press, and it is available. So hop over to their website again after the webinar and please purchase it. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Julia so she can tell us more about her topic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm going to take a minute and share my screen. I'm coming to y'all from Tuscaloosa. Excellent. I'm really thrilled to be here today. I also want to acknowledge that given the community who's gathered here, from forestry and elsewhere, I want to acknowledge that many of you may have familiarity with the landscapes at the heart of this story, so hope to build in some connection that way as well. I have some of this scripted so I can keep myself on track, so you'll see me looking down at my notes, and I'm excited about your questions, and I have a question for you that I'll come back to at the end of this session. So I should say that I'm a historian at the University of Alabama. I'm also a public historian, and that bears importance to the sort of birth of this project. It began, perhaps appropriately enough for this audience, in the woods, in the longleaf pine forests of the Red Hills region of South Georgia and North Florida. I was not there as a forester. I was not there as a hunter, but I was there as a public historian, and I was drawn to the culture of hunting, the rural roads lined with pines, and by the people whose lives and livelihoods were tied to that landscape. So the area I'm talking about is South Georgia, North Florida, Leon County. If you're familiar with tall timbers, which some of you probably are. This is that landscape. I was a very green public history student, a master's student at Florida State University, pursuing a degree in public history. And I was hired by the Thomasville History Center in Thomasville, Georgia, which is on the northern end of the Red Hills region. And you can see part of that is mapped here. I was hired to do oral histories for the History Center with Thomas Countians from all backgrounds, and many of those lives connected to the quail hunting plantations of the region. These formed after Reconstruction in the region when wealthy Northerners, often tied to, the big industries of the Gilded Age, Standard Oil, DuPont, and others, those folks were coming down, buying homes, consolidating lands for the purposes of quail hunting and some timber, and also wildlife management. And I'll come back to that. And I was really intrigued. I'm from Georgia, but it was not a history that I knew. And the interviews really opened up stories about the transformation of land, labor, and leisure. And they pulled me into a much bigger history of how Southerners or people from the U.S. South redefined their relationships to the natural world in the 20th century. That curiosity eventually became Closed Seasons, the book that I'm talking about today. Let's see if I can. There we go. The book asks a simple question. What can changes in game and fish law tell us about how the modern South took shape? And what I found was that across the late 19th and early 20th century, hunting in the South changed from an everyday vernacular practice, a way of working, a way of feeding one's family, even building community, into a regulated, recreational, and in some ways, a deeply symbolic pursuit. Part of that story has to do with the transformation of the commons, the closing of the commons from a resource that many people, not unlimited, but a resource that many people could access to one in which very few could access. And game and fish laws tell us a story about the modernization of the Southern state, and about how class, race, land, and law intersected in shaping access to the natural world. So close seasons weren't just about wildlife cycles. They were metaphors for who had the right to use and move through the southern landscape. So in other words, close seasons marked when hunting stopped, but they also defined how Southerners learned to live within new boundaries, boundaries of time, of land, and even of belonging. And I would connect it to, especially to this audience, by saying that, the stories I'm going to tell today parallel what many of you know from forestry management at the same period. The shift from the open range to a more regulated resource, from informal use and exploitation to state oversight. Let's see. The book focuses on three Deep South states, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And I chose to do that because these states are these sort of focused studies offer a clear arc of change in the region. So, for example, Alabama forms a kind of centerpiece for efforts to create a centralized body of game and fish regulation in a commission. It's the first southern state to create a game commission that lasts over time. Actually, North Carolina is the first, but it doesn't last, and I can talk about that in Q&A if you're interested. And then Mississippi is the last state in the South to form a centralized body of regulation and enforcement. And so by looking at these Deep South states, we can sort of see how conservation efforts unfolded evenly at the state level. They were rooted in local politics and racial hierarchies, which I'll come back to, but they're always in dialogue with national movements, and that's something I really stress in the book. And I briefly want to situate the work in terms of the broader literature. I drew from some very important works in crafting this book. The first that comes to mind is Bert Way's book, Conserving Southern Longleaf, on Herbert Stoddard, which many of you may know. Stoddard came down at the behest of northern quail hunters and really launched a new field of wildlife management. Others have written on very similar themes, although not in the South. Historians like Carl Jacobi and Louis Warren, John Reiger, and others. And then I will say, I want to shout out that this is a moment for historians sort of turning back, looking at hunting and fishing and game regulation. Scott Giltner is someone who has written about this beginning in the late 2000s. I want to give a shout out. I saw Mark Hersey in the chat. Mark has a wonderful co-edits a wonderful series with University of Alabama Press that just published a work by historian Buckley Foster on market hunting in Arkansas, and very much intersects with the themes of my book. Andrea Smalley has written something on with Henry Reeves on the market in plumage and the ways that was regulated over time. So this is a moment in which literature is sort of that these themes are on the minds of historians, and new published work is coming out, and it's really exciting to be in conversation with those scholars. I would also say that, sort of bringing it back to region, I think the story of the US South here adds something new. There is something to be said about persistence and adaptation within a deeply hierarchical social order. And I also just wanted to put the South on the map of conservation, something that, again, coming back to Mark's work, has already been done in important ways. But I'll make my case for why that story needs to continue to be told. I also want to mention that I use intriguing and compelling people to tell the stories that lie at the heart of the book. These are people who were, architects of some of the changes I'm going to talk about, or who, witnessed firsthand the impacts of these changes in regulation of game and fish and non-game species as well. But what's interesting about John Wallace, Charlie Young, and Fanny Cook is that they also had a wonderful sense of historical sensibility. That is, they understood their role in change making and as witnesses. And so it was, in some ways, a joy to use their records to tell this story. And I hope it makes for an interesting read. So you'll learn more about these folks as we go along. So what I want to do is walk you through for the rest of my time, and I need to be checking myself here, walk you through three intertwined transformations that really define the story that I tell in the book. And that is a story about state regulation, about land enclosure, and about federal intervention. So, by the turn of the 20th century, in the South and elsewhere, there certainly existed laws that were aimed at preserving species, non-game and game species. And in the South, those laws were largely patchwork and mostly countywide, and largely without a law of enforcement. That begins to change, and that's the story I'm trying to tell in this book. But you begin to see a really concerted effort in the progressive era, those early decades of the 20th century. And like forestry, the movement to regulate access to game and fish was about rationalizing nature, about defining when and where resources could be used and who could access those resources. Rural Southerners did not speak as one voice, certainly. But if we look at the sort of response to laws as they began to change in the early decades of the 20th century, many Southerners saw these laws as an intrusion, laws like closed seasons, new licensing structures, and other kinds of infringements as they saw it on, traditions that they relied upon, foodways that they relied upon. Many saw these laws as being written, by people in state capitals who had different interests and sometimes inspired by and certainly enforced by outsiders. Alabama, as I mentioned, offers a revealing and important case here. And the architect of the new laws in Alabama was John Wallace Jr. He was born in 1874, the son of a farmer and Confederate veteran. He became the state's first game commissioner in 1907, and he remained in that position until 1922 when he actually died of pneumonia contracted while duck hunting. He was a lawyer, an avid hunter, and he devoted his life to wildlife protection in the interests of the white sportsman. He founded a lobbying organization in the early 20th century, the Alabama Game and Fish Protection, to really sort of win allies in the state legislature and across the state to finally pass a law that would create a centralized state game and fish commission. And he pushed for comprehensive legislation. He wrote the 1907 Game and Fish Law, the bill that became law, which established the state ownership of wildlife, standard seasons of species, protection for non-game birds, and importantly, a warden system and more, which we could talk about. The law was sweeping for its time, certainly in the South. What's interesting about this in the genealogy that I tried to trace is that Wallace was very much in close connection with national leaders of the bird protection movement and game protection movement more broadly. In this case, he was in close touch with leaders of the Audubon Society. And they read the bill, they commented on the bill, they sort of advised him in the political workings of getting the bill passed and gaining support. And once it was passed, one of those leaders, William Dutcher, called the bill the most advanced and drastic game law now in the country. Wallace was quick to agree. He was never shy about self-promotion. He would go on to say that, multiple states adopted Alabama's law as their model. That is true to a certain point, and it was true in Georgia, the neighboring state, which passed a very similar law in 1911. So for the moment, in this early 20th century context, Alabama created a sort of a model of game regulation. But it's also important to note that Southern conservation always reflected Southern priorities. So Wallace knew that, for example, any statewide law had to fit within the region's power structures. It had to be self-supporting. This is in the moment of progressive era centralization when the state was trying to centralize efforts to provide some public services, but Alabama was not going to spend money on a new Game and Fish Commission. So Wallace borrowed models from elsewhere, for example, to create a licensing structure that funded enforcement. Second, Wallace strongly felt that it had to appeal to farmers, the agrarian class, as he called them, by emphasizing property rights. And so he really sort of sells this as a form of trespass law, that hunters were required to get permission of farmers before they could, chase quarry onto another field. And third, Wallace argued that this law supported racial and social hierarchies of the Jim Crow South. In fact, he called his new law the best labor law in the state. He argued that it would um, uh, protect white Southerners from black men with guns. He argued that it would keep black men on the farms in which they worked. And so the laws, at least in motivation, created an exclusive field for sport that was accessible mostly to white landowners and sportsmen who saw themselves really as the natural stewards of the natural world. So just like forestry laws at the time that privileged, landowners as rational managers, game laws constructed an image of stewardship that was racialized and class bound. So we cannot separate the workings of conservation from the politics of exclusion. And this certainly was not unusual. This is happening in the Northeast and elsewhere out west, as the scholars I mentioned, like Jacoby and others, show. But to see, oh, and I should mention, I'm trying to stay on task here, but I should mention I put some letters. What was so fascinating about working with Wallace's records, he was a committed bureaucrat, and so again, he sort of saw himself as making important historical changes. He saved all of the correspondence that came into his office during his tenure as game commissioner, and those letters are really instructive about how people are experiencing the changes in laws on the ground. So the letter on the left here is from a man in Woodville, Alabama, that basically says, the only hunting I do is during Christmas time. I squirrel hunt, and it seems like a hardship that I'm now going to have to pay $3 to hunt, in the county next to mine where I normally go. The letter to the right echoes concerns that many expressed at the time, which is that these laws really were unpopular and there was a broad non-compliance. So people wrote to complain that wardens weren't doing their job in enforcing the law, that people were just ignoring the laws, that grand juries would not convict. So it's important to remember that a law passed is not a law enforced, and Wallace really had to contend with that over the course of his time as commissioner. Um, I turn to another way to sort of look at changes on the landscape by going back to the Red Hills region, which I've already talked about a little bit. And as many of you probably know, some of the history there, but northern visitors really fell in love with the terrain of the Red Hills, and as I mentioned, turned it into one of the South's premier hunting destinations. And it offers a really interesting case study in how conservation, class, and tourism overlapped. Thomasville especially prospered, Thomasville, Georgia, that is, prospered because of the hunting colonies. They employed local workers, black and white, they invested in town institutions, including churches and schools and the Historical Society, and reshaped the economy around seasonal sport. And one of the most interesting documents I found while doing research on the Red Hills was a 44-page memoir written by Charlie Young, and you can see him there on the screen as a teenager. He was born and raised in Thomasville. He worked first as a golf caddy in this new seasonal economy at a golf course created by Northerners in the Red Hills region. And then he worked as a wagon driver, dog trainer, and handler and landscaper for northern tourists, or northern hunters rather, for the rest of his career. So until he retired in the 1940s, he was working in this hunting economy in some way. And in the 1960s, he wrote this memoir. And interestingly, he wrote it for a man who was a young historian at the time at Florida State, William Rogers or Bill Rogers. And so he was explicitly writing for a history audience, a history reading audience. And he was writing to inform Bill's work. Bill, at the time, Bill Rogers was working on county histories of Thomasville and specific histories about some of the quail hunting plantations. And so he was writing with, thinking about historical change. And it's a remarkable piece of writing for many reasons, but in part because he captured how the arrival of wealthy hunters really transformed the region. So he's on the ground and seeing the shift from open woods to fenced estates, from sort of a community hunting or communal hunting to private preserves. And his account really helps us think about what modernization looked like at the ground level. So who's laboring for these hunting plantations, who owned them, how state regulation comes in and shifts things, and how Black Southerners like Charlie Young sort of saw that or understood that change over time. And here's Charlie Young on the screen as an older man. This is with his first wife, Carrie, and granddaughter, Jewel. But I want to stress that Young's account is remarkable for a number of reasons, as I've said. He really speaks explicitly to what he's seeing on the ground. And what his account shows us is that some of the practices of the wealthy northern hunters sort of preceded in spirit the laws that would come about, in this case, in Georgia's case, in 1911. So he, for example, narrates the change in, hunting anywhere you wanted to in those days in his language. The owner asked only that you not, shoot a stock, and that stood a long time. And then he notes that the first trespass sign put up in the country was by a northern man, Dr. Metcalf. So Metcalf was a doctor who came down and was one of the sort of brokers of influence, I guess, bringing other northern hunters with him. And indeed, another important part of the story on the Red Hills is the man you can see here in the picture, H.W. Hopkins, who was a local judge and real estate agent and avid hunter. And you can see him there. He had just come back from a quail hunt. And he was also instrumental in helping Northerners sort of enact the kind of changes that they wanted to see, many bringing practices from the Northeast, things like fencing land and posting land, hiring private wardens to guard against poachers. And Thomas County, in fact, passes a law in the early 1900s that allows for the posting of land. You had to register that land in a ledger in the county courthouse, and that's what you see here. This is also, the Northerners were consolidating land to create these giant estates. They were also leasing land. And at the same time, Southerners who wanted access to hunting land, as the closing of the commons sort of fans out across the South, with fencing laws and other types of trespass laws, begin to have to lease land to access hunting grounds. And so we start to see the sort of seeds of the kinds of parameters that define even modern day hunters. So again, looking at the Red Hills as this kind of microcosm of enclosure. And I should say, just as a heads up to public history work and the kind of field work I did, Jewel Anderson, Charlie Young's granddaughter, was someone I met doing the oral histories in the Red Hills, and someone I spent a lot of time with talking certainly about Charlie Young, but the broader sort of economy of Southern sport and tourism in the Red Hills and the impact it had on her family. So just as a transition, by the 1920s and 30s, Georgia and Alabama had centralized game and fish commissions. So you started to see across the South, not just certainly in the Deep South, a new order of regulated hunting, scientific management that was sort of birthed in some ways in the Red Hills with Herbert Stoddard's work, and that had spread across the South. But it would really take a new moment of federal intervention to fully institutionalize wildlife conservation. And so that's where we can turn to Mississippi as an instructive case study. By the 1930s, as I mentioned early in my remarks, Mississippi still lacked a centralized state game and fish commission. There was some enforcement on the books, but it was inconsistent. The New Deal brought new momentum, certainly to conservation nationally, and Mississippi advocates seized this moment to sort of provide support for centralized regulation. But the Mississippi story also has to consider the progressive era emphasis on women's education that expanded women's roles in conservation leadership. And Fannie Cook, the woman you see on the screen, is a pivotal figure in Mississippi conservation history and also pivotal to the creation of Mississippi's Department of Game and Fish. Cook was born in the late 1880s. She grew up in Crystal Springs, Mississippi, just south of Jackson. She was educated at the Mississippi University for Women, still exists just west of me in Columbus, Mississippi. She became a teacher, but during the First World War, she moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the IRS. But that allowed her to pursue her passion in ecology and biology. And she trained at the Smithsonian and American University. She worked with people like Paul Barsh and others, and she returned to Mississippi in the 1920s to both collect species from Mississippi, which are still in the Smithsonian's collections, but also to begin to organize for conservation laws that protected game and non-game species. Very similarly to John Wallace, she founded a lobbying and educational organization, the Mississippi Association for the Conservation of Wildlife. She was tireless in her efforts to sort of bring average Mississippians into a larger project to care about and preserve both flora and fauna of Mississippi. She traveled statewide with what we would call pop-up exhibits at state fairs and other kinds of places, really educating the public on wildlife protection. And her work paid off, her work and that of others, allies in this effort. In 1932, Mississippi passed legislation to create a centralized state game and fish commission. Again, that success was built on decades of activism. And Cook also had key allies who were legislators in Mississippi, women, particularly women like Lucy Somerville Howarth, who was elected to the legislature, and then her male colleagues kind of put her on the committees that they deemed not as important, like the Parks Committee, but that allowed her then to support Cook's efforts and other folks' efforts to really draw from New Deal funds and put those towards conservation work and public lands preservation more broadly. And the legislation in Mississippi established a commission that looked similar, now to commissions across the state. It had authority over game and fish policy enforcement, scientific research, wildlife refuges and fish hatcheries, licensing and permits, and of course, a warden system. And New Deal programs become critical for Cook and the vision that she wants to enact. She certainly understood the importance of game and fish protection and, of course, non-game species. But what Cook really wanted was a statewide survey of Mississippi flora and fauna. In fact, she'd been influenced by Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold had visited Mississippi, conducted his own surveys. She corresponded with Leopold while he was there and was really inspired by his fieldwork methods and the way that he was writing reports. And so in 1935, Cook applied to the Works Progress Administration, one of the largest New Deal organizations that is probably well known to folks in the audience. Her application was one of Mississippi's first projects, and she used WPA funding to support the survey that she hoped to enact, educational programs, partnerships with universities, women's clubs, 4-H, and Extension Service, and largely public outreach. In fact, Fannie Cook really believed in the power of museums. She thought museums were a important sort of form of informal education that would again bring Mississippians into larger efforts of conservation and preservation. In 1939, her vision was realized to open a state wildlife museum in Jackson that still exists. She directed it until retiring in 1958. And you can see that Mississippi has erected a statue in her honor in Crystal Springs there on the slide. So though Mississippi was the last state in the South to create a game and fish commission, it was largely because of Fannie Cook's work. She combined her scientific expertise, grassroots organizing, strategic federal funding, and her efforts marked the 1930s as a decisive decade for wildlife protection in Mississippi, thanks to her savvy use and drawing from larger efforts, federal efforts. So quickly, and I'm still on time, I do want to offer a few notes of conclusion that game and fish commissions were, of course, never detached from state building in the modernizing South. They drew their power from the transformation of property rights in the late 19th century, from a protectionist sentiment especially on behalf of sportsmen and people who identified as sportsmen, but also of bird advocates and scientists, and from the consolidation of state functions in the early 20th century. Though commissions evolved to become more effective protectors of wildlife over time, the laws implemented by early 20th century commissions, like those crafted by John Wallace, had anti-democratic motivations and revealed a vision for the natural world that was exclusive, according to race and property ownership. Game and Fish Commissions were distinctly shaped by Southern politics and priorities, but also meshed easily with a national conservation movement that, found its boogeymen in non-white hunter, trappers, and game sellers. They're the last region in the nation to enact a conservation code like the one I've described. The South quickly caught up, and by the 1930s, its approach to game and fish proceeded in line with national trends in the emerging field of wildlife management. Southern conservation, like the rest of the region, was modernized by federal funding and partnership, a relationship that in some ways had begun a couple decades before. So the Deep South, with closed seasons and closed lands, was a landscape by the 1930s transformed for hunters, fishers, and prey alike. Thank you so much. And as you see there, I have a question for those of you in forestry. I'm curious to know what you might see as the parallels between forest management and game management in this era, because in some ways, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, some of these folks advocating for new state game and fish laws were not thinking about forestry, and some were in different ways. But thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Julia. That was great. A lot to think about, a lot to unpack as well, which is which should make for a lively Q&A. So just a reminder to folks, please use the Q&A portion of the forum and not the chat forum to submit your questions. I got to bring that up myself. So, but yeah, you please use the Q&A forum. And I really, like I said, there's a lot to unpack there, and you did a fine job. And I'm, of course, kind of drawn to the Charlie Young story. In particular, that Bill Rogers asked him to write a memoir. And so I guess I'm going to ask you to just elaborate a little bit more on that. I don't know if you have the background or not, the backstory, but that's utterly fascinating that Bill did that.
Yeah, actually, what I learned is that Bill didn't do that.
Oh,
So the provenance of that piece is still slightly unclear, but I have a theory. So I found it in the records of the Thomasville History Center, as I mentioned. It was really kind of tucked under and buried under vertical files, and it was a copy of a microfilmed version, but I could never find the original. But what I learned was a couple of important things. One was at the time, Bill Rogers, who was still alive when I was writing, he's no longer with us now, but he had been commissioned to write a history of some of the plantations by one of those plantation owners, a woman named Pansy Poe, who owned Pebble Hill Plantation, that some folks might know. Pansy Poe was a descendant, Elizabeth Pansy Poe was a descendant of the Hanna family, kind of a political dynasty, Mark Hanna and others in the late 19th century. Pansy Poe was commissioning Bill to do some of this, and it was Pansy Poe who actually reached out to locals who then informed Bill's writing. And Charlie Young had connections with Pansy Poe. He had grown up at Pebble Hill. His uncles worked as chauffeurs and on the estates in different ways. And he had spent a lot of time. She knew him. His second wife also was at the time working as sort of a janitorial assistant at the Historical Society. And so when I found the piece and I saw it was written for Bill Rogers, I thought, oh, great, I'll call Bill and ask him, to tell me more. But he never received it. He said he never remembers seeing it. He didn't know about it. So there was some disconnect along the way. But when I talked to Jewel, his granddaughter, I interviewed her multiple times. We'd also interviewed her mother, Charlie Young's granddaughter, or daughter, excuse me, before she passed, Virginia Anderson. So we had this amazing sort of genealogical lineage, reflections on their family and on his story. And what became clear was that he absolutely wanted this story to be told. And so it was real a wonderful chance to get to work with that primary source.
okay. Just as a side note, I was at Florida State in the early 90s. I remember Bill
Yeah.
a little bit. I didn't take classes with him, but it's like, whoa, flashback. Um, Alex asks, he says, they say, as someone who specializes in World War I and larger questions around ethnicity and war making, um, this is what you presented on is a little bit outside their field, but um, they see the intersection. So the question is, in your research, did you see interactions between the forts and the training grounds built in the South? Um, Definitely during World War II, but there may have been a little bit during World War I. Nevertheless, did you see interactions between the forts and the training grounds built in the South and these new military populations that came in the development of game and forestry management and maybe management laws as well?
I have to say I'm sorry I did not, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. And I could see, it makes me even wonder how those as sort of federal lands, right, might have also been opened up possibilities for hunting. I just don't know. And I'm sorry I don't know, but that's a great question. I will say because there is, the body of literature is growing on these questions around hunting and fishing and regulation, but it's not immense. And so what I imagine this book as sort of a modest contribution, but there's so much left to be explored. I mean, I had a my contract with UNC Press, had a word count limit. So, I had to leave things on the cutting room floor, but the forestry aspect of this, the kind of management of oysters, the kind of commercial
Mm.
exploitation that was allowed, there's so much that could be written on, and that is a fascinating question about military installations as also a part of the modernizing South and how those might have featured in all this, but I can't say directly.
Yeah, and of course, since they've um, some of the military landscapes, because they have hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of
Right.
acres, it's
Yeah.
become great for game and wildlife management. So I really like that we've got a couple questions that I'm going to try to tie together regarding prescribed fire and the flip side of that being fire suppression.
Hmm.
So it looks like one is a comment, but one is a question. Tom Gero points out parallels. Protecting game or wildlife was also given as a reason to keep fire out of forests. So we're gonna come back to Herb Stoddard. I can see him on the horizon with his drip torch ready to come talk to us. Um, Protecting game and wildlife had, keeping fire out. Um, it not only protected, the idea was protect timber from fire, but also protect wildlife. Now we know the ecological role of fire. But
Yeah.
we had an anonymous contributor say or ask, in your research, was prescribed or traditional burning discussed in the context of game laws and wildlife management as they developed in the South? So do you want to talk a bit more about that?
They were later, but not in this progressive era moment. In fact, so to take Alabama as example, the game wardens were also appointed as fire wardens. Of course, they were not compensated. The only way they made money was by successful convictions. Basically they had additional duties of trying to suppress forest fires. So there was some connection between in Wallace's mind in writing this bill, of course, about habitat and protect. I mean, I think somebody already, I'm sorry, Tom, I think already pointed to this, like the need to keep out fire to protect game, and that was absolutely sort of how the architects, at least of these early 20th century game and fish commissions, imagined it, that fire was something to repress
Mhm.
and that he imagined that game wardens were going to do that job, that that would be part of their job.
Yeah, there's a lot of doubling up on uh, jobs like that. And so, can you talk a little bit then about why Herb Stoddard and his work with and use of prescribed burning, why this flew in the face of the almost edicts coming out of the U.S. Forest Service and other agencies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there may be some on this call who probably know about more about that than I do. You know, I
Mhm.
know from Bert's work the kind of importance that takes on. I will say that Herbert Stoddard, he intersects in Mississippi's laws as well. So when
Okay.
Fannie Cook is having these conversations with Aldo Leopold about the survey, Herbert Stoddard is also talking to Fannie Cook and sort of sharing with her what's happening, in the Red Hills region, basically what the kinds of work he's done. By that point, I think the Bob White Quail had been published, and so she had access to that, right? So I think, his work, though it's not informing some of the earliest efforts at these laws, like his work becomes pronounced by the second decade and certainly third decade of the 20th century, and those who are trying to build really advocacy for game and fish protection, but making sure that intersection between forestry is also present in the conversation. And I will also give a shout out to Herbert Stoddard too for another reason, and this is something that became really clear in my own work on especially the earlier years of this movement to create new game and fish regulation. And that is that certainly the federal government becomes important by the 1930s with the advent of the New Deal, but the federal government is also very much at work helping men like John Wallace and folks in Georgia and North Carolina and elsewhere, especially through the Bureau of Biological Survey, which was
Mm.
part of the Department of Ag, of course, that employed Herbert Stoddard, right, and who sent him down initially. The Bureau of Biological Survey and T.S. Palmer, who led that office, did yeoman's work for men like Wallace. I mean, guiding their work, coming down to give speeches to the Alabama legislature, the Georgia legislature, or whatever, commenting on the bill that Wallace wrote. And then, in Wallace's, the other thing that's really great about his records is he wrote these biennial reports that are really handy and digitized. And Palmer sort of wrote a history of the attempts in the South to create game and fish legislation. So what Palmer from the Bureau of Biological Survey is also documenting this work in interesting ways. So
Hmm. Speaking of accessing stuff online, John Hines asks if the Charlie Young memoir is digitized and available online. Do you know?
It's not, but I'm happy to share it as I've transcribed it and would be happy to share it. And
Wow.
also, if you go to the Thomasville Historical Society or Thomasville History Center, as it's called now, you can find it in their catalog.
Hmm.
And Ephraim Rotter is the curator, wonderful person. He, I bet, would send a scan of that. Yes, I hope that more people access that resource in particular because there's a lot to unpack there.
I'm going to encourage you to think about doing an annotated version of edition of his memoir,
Yeah.
because it sounds like a really valuable resource. So, and we'll put a well. I was thinking, yeah, if you can provide me with the information, then we'll provide links, as you were mentioning, um, so people could access it. But I see an opportunity for your next publication.
Yeah, and I just put my email in the chat if anyone would like to
Okay,
reach out
thanks.
about any of these sources.
Yeah, and I'll have it in the follow-up emails as well. Um, a couple of folks are curious about the North Carolina um, Game Commission and that it was created and then went away. Can you fill in that blank for folks?
Yes, so it was created almost at the turn of the century, and it was an interesting model because it basically what the state did was it gave purview of a new centralized state game and fish commission to the North Carolina Audubon Society. So it was sort of a cooperative partnership between the state and Audubon. And it essentially failed because of market hunters in the Currituck Sound.
Hmm.
That they were, they had powerful allies in the state legislature, and those folks were able to basically gut the law eventually. And so by the time Wallace was working the North Carolina model, and it was there were attempts to recreate it in South Carolina and in Georgia that just sort of fell flat. But it is an interesting study.
Mhm. Hayes Brown asks if Wallace considered or looked at European models of game management, or did he? I love I love Hayes's question here. Or given his self-confidence, did Wallace decide to invent the wheel himself? So
You
where did Wallace what?
Yes, this was one of the things I appreciate the question. This is one of the things that I really spent time doing, is trying to trace the genealogy basically of these laws. And he was really drawing, I mean, as I mentioned, he had a lot of allies in the sort of national movements. The bird protection movement was important. In fact, he was a state legislator for several years before the dawn of the 20th century. And during that time, he was able to pass the so-called model law for bird protection, which was created by the American Ornithologists Union, that defined what birds were game birds, what birds were not. So the model law actually becomes sort of central to what Wallace then creates as the Game and Fish Commission. Later, he retains that piece, and other southern states pass the model law before they have a centralized Game and Fish Commission. So the bird protection movement was important. Certainly, efforts in places like Pennsylvania. I think we have some Pennsylvanians in the audience. He was drawing from those models of game protection. Where I saw more of the European influence, the conversations, not only with Europe, but elsewhere, was around bird migration. So he becomes really committed to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act
Okay.
and the iterations of that in the subsequent years after he creates the Game and Fish Commission, and he's working with national leaders in conservation to make sure that that law is passed. He's working in close concert with John Bankhead, who's a senator from Alabama. And he's also corresponding with people, especially in Latin America and South America, but also elsewhere about models of migratory protection. And in true Wallace fashion, there were threats to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and he starts this kind of press campaign about how successful it's been, and he claims that Alabama has had the most arrests under that treaty, by 1920 or something. So he was very self-laudatory. And there was some truth to what I don't think that's totally baseless, but yeah. So part of what I wanted to do, was really fascinated to do, was trace that lineage.
So an outstanding self-promoter, and that's not unusual also in that era.
Yeah, true.
That's how Gifford Pinchot kind of got his career going in forestry.
Yeah.
You look closely at his claims, you're like, not so much there, Giff. um, oh, here we go. Anonymous attendee asks, were you able to differentiate the difference in attitudes or how people used or viewed wildlife resources between these three communities, white, black, and native peoples
Yeah.
throughout the South in that time?
Say
And
the
what
first
sources would you use for that?
say Will you say the first part of that question again? I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
were you able to differentiate the differences in attitudes
Oh yeah.
or how people used or viewed wildlife resources between the white, the black, and the native American communities?
I would say that I think some of that was, there are traditions in hunting, and I think sometimes, those fall along kind of racial or ethnic lines, but sometimes they also fall along class lines.
Mhm.
And so I think when for example, Charlie Young talks about growing up in a family, an African American family who hunted at night, right? Who hunted things like raccoon and possum at night, sometimes with a dog, etc. And not, of course, but I see that almost more as a sort of a Southern lower class. Those are sort of Southern lower class preoccupations, partly because people were also hunting to eat some of that prey. I think it falls more along class lines. And so, one of the most important informal research assistants I had was my red-bone coonhound, Red. This gets to the point because every time my partner James and I take Red on a walk, almost every time, and especially living in Alabama, we're stopped by people to admire him. He's a handsome dog, but to tell people want to tell stories about hunting with dogs. And I'll never forget that a man stopped me at some point and said, Oh God, I loved hunting with red bones, and we used to hunt at night with them, hunt
Hmm.
raccoons, and there was nothing like it. And so we just got to talking, and I said, "That's great. What else did you hunt? Like, did you ever hunt quail?" And he looked at me as if I were like an alien, and he was like, "No, I never hunt quail." He's like, "No, quail is not." I didn't have the gear, I didn't have the gun, I didn't have, it wasn't something. So I think that connects back to this day, right? That quail becomes a really popular, for as an example, a really popular form of prey among people who consider themselves sportsmen because it's hard to shoot on the wing. There's foodway traditions around that and doves, et cetera. But quail, I mean, Charlie Young even speaks to this in his piece. He said, quail were everywhere. You could buy them at the market, and then
Sure.
they became overshot, and so then obviously that leads to Stoddard, et cetera. So I think there's more. What I saw is more class division, but I also want to speak to the native presence in this because I was looking at the Deep South, but of course there are Native people in the Deep South, and Southerners, black and white and Native, Choctaw, were working with Fannie Cook. So Fannie Cook, one thing that I spoke about to a degree, but would like to write more about, is Fannie Cook wanted to establish quail preserves on individual farms, and this was after sort of talking with Stoddard and Leopold and thinking about how to protect quail. And she was working with landowners of all kinds, and it's interesting to sort of see that they sort of crossed racial and ethnic lines, and were part of her sort of imagination for conservation in the 1930s.
Hmm. Isabella Banner, who is also has a public history background. We appreciate her sharing that. Asks, with the closure of the commons to local and non-wealthy people who relied on them, were they given information by like the individual states on how these groups of people were supposed to change and adapt, or were they just left on their own to figure it out?
I mean,
How did the governments, other than enforcement, how did governments deal with this issue?
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so, it's interesting. Wallace, as I said, received volumes of letters about this very thing. Like,
Hmm.
I don't understand now what's required of me. I don't want to break the law. What land can I access? How can I access that land? So, like many other states, he had the laws printed up both in sort of small pamphlet form that you could keep in your pocket, but he also sent out sort of circulars that could be nailed onto a courthouse or something, especially in 1907 and 1908 when the laws were new. And I would say that, as Charlie Young narrates, people just started seeing posted signs go up,
Yeah.
right? That this became, and fence laws were changing too. But I will say, Southerners, there was an impact here. So though there was a lot, as I said, there was rural resistance in the form of non-compliance with these laws. But I would say when you can track convictions, because Wallace reported his convictions every year, the highest number of convictions came from the statute that said that you had to ask the landowner for permission. So essentially, these laws worked as a form of trespass law and pretty effectively in the broader scheme of the statutes themselves. And so I think a lot of Southerners were confused, and it took time. I think that's why Wallace, I think he was genuinely someone who was a racist and absolutely thought he blamed black hunters for overhunting. He
Mm.
also used race baiting to sort of motivate other ordinary white Southerners to basically embrace these laws, right? Including the closing, the way that they limited access to land.
So it was kind of a hand in glove with Jim Crow
Yes,
in
I
that
think I
way.
think in his mind, at least, he's
Yeah.
extending Jim Crow into the rural um,
Okay.
landscape.
Someone had asked a little bit about that, and so I appreciate that you touched on that. Are you familiar with the Dixie Crusaders in the 1930s
I don't think so.
or 1920s? It was a 3-year program that went around. It was an education program that went into rural communities, and it was trying to educate people about the need to keep fire out of the woods.
Okay.
Um, and if you will, it was kind of a Smokey Bear campaign before there was Smokey Bear.
Yeah.
And the I'm working towards a question on this, and that so I'll give you a little more context, and maybe then you can take a stab at the question. And if you can't, then I understand because it's. But they sent trucks around and they gave lectures. They'd roll into these rural communities, and sometimes they had slideshows or movies about the danger of fire, or the why fire was evil. Um, but in essence, as this questioner phrases it, it was like a regional propaganda machine.
Yeah.
Um, and so the question is, how do groups like the Dixie Crusaders overlap with the very real reality that hunting access and by extension prescribed burning for supporting species were monopolized by wealthy white owners? So and I can tell you that the Dixie Crusaders were supported by the American Forestry Association.
Mm.
Um, by by the way, if you or others tuning in, we have the AFA's records here at FHS.
Mm.
So if you want to dig into the Dixie Crusaders and this topic more, please come. Um, but this is what they're so this is an organization that is predominantly, if not exclusively, white, not by necessarily by its codes or membership codes, but it's a public citizen group. It's established in 1875, and they're teaming up with the or working in the New Deal era of the Dixie Crusaders
Okay.
and trying to this is their campaign to stamp out fire in the backcountry of the Appalachian Mountain region. So this is I'm sure they're operating in the Deep South. So Wallace is a great example, of course, of this white elite. Is
Right.
there more of that when we move into the Charlie Young era and the Fannie Cook, where it's this white elite top down uh, at these efforts? And I'll go back to the question of propaganda, if you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think that intersects nicely with what they were doing. I mean, they saw again, like, Fanny Cook comes a little bit later in this kind of work, but Wallace absolutely was framing a lot of this. I think propaganda is an interesting way to sort of phrase it, because he's trying to convince what he called the agrarian class. So that sort of works out to be kind of white smallholders, that
Mm.
these laws were good for them, that in fact they were on the front lines of game protection, that they indeed were game wardens of a kind, because they had interest in protecting their land. Um, and so he relied on um, certainly he traveled around the state quite a bit. He also bought enthused about and kept going educational initiatives like the Bird Day, an annual Bird Day. This was created by Audubon, so he didn't create it, but he definitely established worked with the school system, the public school system across Alabama, to get children sort of involved in learning bird preservation and understanding why it was important for these, and really these sort of reflect a kind of middle class understanding of landscape and beauty, and other sorts of aesthetics that I think were important to Wallace. So it wasn't just for his hunting, but what you really see is that men who imagine themselves as sportsmen imagine themselves following a certain kind of ethos or creed, one of mastery, certainly, one of recognizing bag limits, of shooting the right kind of prey, right, of participating in things like fox hunts. And I think the laws themselves reflect those interests. Whatever Wallace told people, I think the laws really reflect that. But what's interesting is that these were, even his approach to codifying these and then changing them over time was fluid. And rural people had a lot of say in, for example, closed seasons, right? The title of the book. I mean, there's examples of him, at least in the initial passage of these laws in 1907, he set the squirrel closed season beginning at, or the open season rather, beginning in November 1st. Well, that pissed off, frankly, a lot of rural Southerners who, who shot squirrels in August, in August before the oak trees drop their acorns. Is a practice called barking off. They wanted to shoot squirrels earlier in the season, or they wanted to shoot doves earlier in the season. So he actually changes those
Oh,
laws in the initial years and moves the open season for squirrels to August 1st. And then the sportsmen get angry at him and say, "What are you doing?" So he's trying to walk a line. Partly that's in response to, he lived through the years of populist revolt in Alabama. He saw how close
yeah.
Alabama came to a successful, sort of popular, sympathizing state government. And I think in some ways he understood the power of rural people, and was trying to, in some ways, in his own way, speak to that, but across lines of race and class.
That's what I was wondering about how populism might have fit in.
Yeah.
So we're going to finish with a question from Richard Wrights. And you had mentioned that Wallace and these other figures were talking with national leaders in
Mhm.
conservation, one of whom was William Hornaday. And
Yes.
so the question is, was Hornaday, was work by Hornaday used in developing some of these hunting regulations?
It was, and Wallace was a big fan of Hornaday, and he was actually he corresponded with Hornaday quite a bit,
Okay.
especially later around migratory bird protection. In fact, he strategizes with Hornaday when there are challenges to the law that creates the Treaty Act. He sort of corresponds with Hornaday and says, I think I'm going to bring a test case against this, and I'm going to try to make that test case come up to the Supreme Court, so they'll finally decide that this is a constitutional law. And Hornaday's like, "Are you crazy?" You know, they've already, they've determined it's constitutional because they passed the law. We don't need a test case. And so there's correspondence between them. There's clearly, some sharing of information and he was part of Hornaday's broader networks by the 19 teens. And again, that correspondence is in those Department of Conservation records at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And I
Mhm.
would be happy to, like, I've scanned a lot of that. I could share that or at least point you in the right direction if anybody wants to see those letters.
That's very kind and generous of you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a public historian. And so
Yeah.
the beauty of public historians is that I think almost, always we are not people who are territorial. In fact, my hope is that hunters and fishers will read this book, and I'd love to see a public history of hunting in the South. I'd love to see oral
Mhm.
history projects emerge. I would love to see other scholarship emerge from some of the questions that this book raises. And so I'm always happy to share.
So Julia, thank you again for today and for the presentation.
Thank you for having me. It's really an honor, and I appreciate everyone's attention and questions.